I sat with him. I was in pain. All the bid'ahs that he was sharing with me. He said, yeah, some say you can say Allahu Akbar or Kabir Allah. you can say this, you can say that. And he was coming with things that there was no dalil for it, right? And then remember what I told him? I said, Ya Shaykh, كاد كلامك أن يكون كفرا. I said, your words could have been kufr. And then he said, do you have a Salafi background? And I said, yes. And then it took me a very long time to adapt to fiqh. Because I was used for 10 years to, without the tools, right? To just navigate through Quran and Sunnah and making my own deen. Just follow Kitab and Sunnah. That was my motto. That was my slogan. Just Quran and Sunnah. And now somebody was telling me it's not like you think. There is a heritage of 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, that we go by. So tasawwuf was very easy for me to accept. Aqeedah was very easy for me to accept. But fiqh was the most difficult thing. It took me more than a year to understand that you have to follow madhab. That was the most difficult thing. So this is a bit how my journey went from this to that. And the reason why was because of exposure. Exposing myself to material that was out there just waiting to be read. And since after that, I never read about people, I read from people. And then in 2005, 2006, I borrowed from someone, I think 21 books of the Zaydiyah that I then wanted to read about hadith and fiqh and their aqeedah and so forth. Because before we carry on, you cannot judge someone by not reading them, not reading their books. That was one of the biggest mistakes I made when I was a Salafi. Now when I was a Salafi, and I don't regret that period because it taught me many things. What it taught me was the love for hadith. What it taught me was the love for practicing the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so much more, and also to have a structure in my studying. So it contributed to many good things, not to bad things, or to many good things. So now, when I was a Salafi, my scholars would tell me not to read certain books because these people would be mubtadi'ah. So that is where they would say, don't read the books of Zahid al-Kawthari, don't read the books of Abu Ghudda, don't read the books of al-Ghazali, don't read the books of Ibn al-Jawzi, don't read the books of al-Razi, all the people where you can learn from, don't read them. And if you want to read some of their books, read it with the tahqiq, with the verification of a Salafi scholar. So that is where I went wrong. Because I believed everything they said, and I believed that the ummah was always upon what they claimed to be the haqq. So now, then they printed the book, Shaykh Mashhur Hassan Salman, with whom I studied, Hafidahullah Azza wa Jalla, a very knowledgeable man. He then wrote a book in many volumes, multiple volumes, Kutub Haddara Minha al-Ulama, books that were warned against by the scholars. So we were afraid to read books. I was very much so manipulated and conditioned. So I was afraid to read these books. I really thought, if I read these books, I go to hell. So until one day, I had my friend Muhammad Dandis, and he was Ash'ari, Shafi'i, and he believed in Tasawwuf, in a Tasawwuf Sunni. And he said, read this book. And it was a book of Badruddin ibn Jama'ah, of the Aqeedah, of the people back in the days, Idah al-Dalil. And I said, I'm not going to read this, I'm not going to hell. And he was my good friend, but we never spoke about Aqeedah. Because I believed him to be a mubtadi', but he was still my friend. And he believed me to be wrong. He never said, you're a mubtadi'. I said, one thing, we never talk about Aqeedah. Because I felt if we were to go speak about Aqeedah, that we would no longer be friends. And that's the same with, anyway. So then one day I sat there, and there were many books of Dr. Yusuf al-Qaradawi. I was still completely Salafi. And there was a book, the Hikam al-Ata'iyya with the Sharh of al-Buti. So I just opened the book. I didn't know which book it was. So I opened it. I said, oh, that's beautiful. Wow. And then I said, Buti, no. But then the Hikam al-Ata'iyya stayed because I liked the words and I didn't know who he was. So then I started reading the Hikam al-Ata'iyya and I found it so beneficial. But I didn't know that Ibn Ata'illah was actually the student of Abu Hassan al-Shadili, right? Otherwise I would have thrown the book away. And then after that, I'm just telling you my story so that you understand where I'm coming from. Because I was a very good Salafi. Now, when I changed, a lot of them turned against me and became a kind of woke. But I was a very Salafi. I sat with the students of Shaykh al-Albani rahmatullahi alayhi, and I benefited a lot from them. Shaykh al-Halabi rahmatullahi alayhi, I studied with him Fath al-Bari of Ibn Rajab, and Nubath fi Usul al-Fiqh of Ibn Hazm. Shaykh Mashhur Salman, the Sahih Muslim, the Sharh of Sahih Muslim, the Usul al-Waraqat, Tafsir. Shaykh Abu Islam Salih Taha, I did Bulugh al-Maram rahmatullahi alayhi, and al-Wajiz, and al-Sharh al-Mumti ala Zad al-Mustaqni', and then so many other things. Shaykh Musa Nasr, Quran, al-Wajiz fil Fiqh. So I studied with them. At a certain point I was translating for them. So I was close to them. It's not like I wasn't, but I was also afraid. Because when you leave people and you are an important part in their midst, then it's very difficult for them to let you go. Because I was a real student of knowledge, but in the Salafi world. So I would literally learn by heart Aqidat al-Wasitiyya. Like I said, Usul al-Thalatha, Lum'at al-I'tiqad. I would learn the poems of Al-Hafid al-Hakami in Aqidah by heart. So I would learn all of it by heart, literally. And so I know what they believe. And I'm not biased when I speak. It's literally what I'm sharing with you is based on 10 years of studying within the Salafi realms, and I've learned a lot of good things really. And then making that transition towards what I now believe to be 100% in line with what I believe that the Ummah was upon since long ago. So I sat there and then I said, no, not Idahu Dalil. I said, And then they said, why don't you read from Al-Qardawi? I said, Qardawi? Shaykh al-Albani told us that if Al-Qardawi if Qardawi believes what he says, then he's for hell. So that is what Al-Albani said about Qardawi. So I said, how am I going to read Hellboy's book? Now it's true, right? And that's really what I thought. I'm not going to hell. Subhanallah. So I took a book, and I said, what's the least worst I can choose? Because he just opened it. He said, your foundation is strong. And there was a book about hijab al-mar'ah, the hijab of the hijab. And I started reading. I said, subhanAllah, uses hadith. No? Qardawi uses hadith. And then he looks at me like, yes. And ayat, and lugha, and words of the Salihin. He said, what did you expect? He's a scholar. I said, scholar. So I started reading, and then I said, okay, I'm going to read another book and I'm going to take it home. That was Al-Fan fil Islam, Art in Islam. Until today, it is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. It was about art in Islam. It made me love Islam. I loved Islam already, but now I really felt the love for the birds and the trees and the flowers and the bees, for everything. Now the shapes and the forms, the colors, the sounds of the birds and the whistling of the humans. He introduced me to an other dimension, literally. And then I said, okay, I'm going to buy all of these books, but they weren't all there. So I took about 80 books home and I started reading them one after the other. I'm not a Qardawist now, but I definitely believe that the man comes with a lot of knowledge. Definitely. So anyway, that was my thing, my introduction to something else in the Salafi. Then in 2003, I was also sitting with Shaykh Mashhur and he was delivering a tafsir, and then there were a lot of beautiful sayings. What I would do when I would sit in my class, I would write down everything the Shaykh says. And then when he says Abdullah ibn Abbas says, or the beautiful sayings, then I would go to the library and then I would look, because I had no program, Shamil or whatever. I would go through the books and look for who said it. But then I came to a point where I found that the quotes that were being passed on were sometimes from people like Ibn al-Jawzi, from his book Zad al-Masir, sometimes from a Sha'arawi, rahmatullahi alayhi, who was supposed to be very dangerous. And Sayyid Qutb, reading Sayyid Qutb, that made you the mubtadi' of the mubtadi'as. It's the thing that people don't know, is that like some 40 years ago, that the Mufti of Saudi Arabia said that the tafsir of Sayyid Qutb is a tafsir that everybody should read. But now they warn against it. So he made a mukhtasar. But not of that. So anyway, to cut a long story short, and then came the biggest challenge. Not yet. Was Aqidah. I believe that the Asha'ira and the Maturidiyya were shayateen al-ins. They were the shaitans of humanity that came, that were possessed by shayateen to corrupt religion and our belief in Allah Jalla wa Ala subhanahu wa ta'ala. And every book that I had, in the preface, in the introduction, it would say, the alim is good, the alim is very knowledgeable, but he had the aqidah of the majority of the people in that time and didn't have access to the true aqidah. You read that in the books of Al-Hafid ibn Hajar, of Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, of Imam al-Nawawi, of Imam al-Razi, of Imam al-Ghazali. You have all of that, all of them actually saying, and even I have and I ripped it out of my book now. I bought the Kaba'ir, Zawajib an Iqtiraf al-Kaba'ir of Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, which is for me a better book than the one of Imam al-Dhahabi about al-Kaba'ir. And then I opened the book, and in the preface, in the introduction, it said, وَكَانَ كَثِيرٍ مِنْ أَهْلِ زَمَانِهِ مِنْ مُخَنَّثِي الْأَشَاعِرَةِ. So how would you say مُخَنَّث Sayyidi?
I gave it last time, but it's not.
No. Yeah, no, it's but I'm not going to translate it. So anyway, yani female men, let us just say it like that to make it. So he was exactly like the majority of the scholars in his days, yani among these feminized men of the Ash'ara. The problem, so I hated Ash'ara. I really did. I hated Ash'ara, and I hated the madhab, and especially the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa, because he was the furthest away from Kitab and Sunnah. I had read in the book, in the creed of Imam al-Barbahari, that we were being taught that Allah didn't look at Abu Hanifa from the very day that he was buried. He never looked at him again. And in that book, and I'm not exaggerating, it says that people who love Imam Abu Hanifa or stay in a place where he's mentioned in a good way, they are worse than people undressing themselves in a mosque and getting drunk. That is what I was raised with. So Imam Abu Hanifa, no. So now, I read the book Idah al-Dalil with all my baggage, right, of years and years. And I went through Idah al-Dalil, I read it in one sitting. And like a house of cards, everything I had learned just fell down. He convinced me immediately. One book, and that's the practical side of Aqidah. How to apply the usul of Aqidah on the ayat and the hadith from a lughawi aqli perspective. So anyway, so I read that and said, oh, okay, that's gone. So now I believe that, the Ash'ari were the majority of the ummah, whether the people like it or not. No, that's not true. Everybody according them repented. Imam al-Ghazali, right before he died, I'm not an Ash'ari. Naam, true. Imam al-Razi, I'm not an Ash'ari. I want to die like people, like that old lady in the mountains, with that faith. Yani, Aqidat al-Ajuz. Imam al-Nawawi, a book is written that he distanced himself from everything he said in his explanation of Sahih Muslim. So I believed all of that. But then I started reading, I said, but what they are saying is not true. Are they doing this deliberately? I don't think so, because I saw many good people, pious people that were there, but they did not read the other side. I believe that. They didn't. And I believe that a lot of them, if they would have read it, and not just read about them, but would have dived, right? No, if they would have dived, right? If they would have dived into these books, that they would have changed the way they perceive things. So the majority of the muhaddithin, the majority of the mufassirin, the majority of the fuqaha, the majority of the linguists, now the majority of historians, all of them were either Ash'ari or Maturidi. All of them. Just a few of them were not. And if they were not upon what the people claim today. They were just Mufawwida. And that's the asl. Al-aslu huwa tafweed. That means that you do not interpret the what? The attributes of Allah Jalla wa Ala. You don't interpret it at all, and you don't say anything. That's the asl. But then Aqidah was necessary because people started embodying Allah Jalla wa Ala, or they started describing Allah to have a body like a human being. So that is where the knowledge of Aqidah grew. So I read the book, that went. Then I was introduced to a Sufi Shaykh. Wow, I was in need, Habibi. So I'm doing this so that you know my story. So my apologies. I never shared it with that much detail. So I was going through a very difficult period in time in Jordan, and I saw Shaykh Suhail, Dr. Shaykh Suhail Hanif.
Trouble now.
Excuse me?
He's going to be in trouble. I mean,
No, I don't think so. He was not a doctor yet. And he was studying with Dr. Salah Abul Hajj. In the Markaz Anwar al-Ulama. I saw him, he was so kind. And his face was shining. And I loved him. Until he said that he was a Hanafi and started making wudu in a strange way. The Hanafi way. And then praying like this. With the hands below the... And then I said, then all of a sudden, because I had that still Salafi kind of fiqh going on, I felt so much more, astaghfirullah, knowledgeable than him. I said, poor guy. Can you imagine? But not like I didn't dislike him. I said, poor guy. And subhanAllah, he's very eloquent, he speaks Arabic, and he doesn't know how to make wudu. But I was never introduced to madhabs. He doesn't know how to make wudu, doesn't know how to... He became my fiqh teacher afterwards. So even though he doesn't like me to say this, but it's true. Yani we read parts of different texts in the Hanafi fiqh, being al-Mukhtar, being Fath Bab al-Inaya, or being it part of al-Quduri, yani, and other things. So anyway, so now I was there with him, and then I was like really desperate. And there was another man like him, doing the strange wudu, doing the strange salah. And I spoke to him and said, I can't give you spiritual advice, but I know somebody who can. I said, whom? And he mentioned the name of a Sufi Shaykh. I said, that man is a kafir. Yani, this person was a murid of that Shaykh. I said, he's a kafir. His books are kufr. He didn't even become angry. He laughed, he smiled. He said, did you ever read his books? I said, no. He said, read them. I said, I'm not gonna read the book once again of Hellboy. I'm not gonna do that. So anyway, I was so desperate that I asked him for the address of the Shaykh. So I went. He took me to a zawia. You should know, that was only within the first 6 months, right? Of my transition. Today that sounds very strange. Yani, only within the first 6 months of my religious transition. And so now I walked in. I actually don't walk like this. So I walked. Anyway, I walked, and there was the name of the zawiyah, which I'm not going to mention, and that was really a Sufi name. That was the name of a man I knew to be for hell once again. But I said, I really need an answer to my problem. So I said, go ahead, you go first. And there were like 2 floors. I've never done as much dhikr in such a short time frame as then. I said, if I go into the zawiyah, what I believe, because that is what I was taught, Sufi sheikhs do sihr. When they give you water, don't drink it, because you will become their slaves and give them your money. Sufi sheikhs, they don't pray. Sufi sheikhs have more right over your family than you do. That's what they say. That's what we were taught. Like when you get married, the wife of the sheikh, or your wife goes to the sheikh first. This is what we were being taught, and I know it's vulgar, but this is in the books that we were reading. Sheikh don't pray. Sheikh don't fast. Because sheikh is way up. All the way up. So if you're going to think about this, barakallahu feekum, imagine now me having to go to a zawiyah. I thought I would find Sahara in the zawiyah. People doing sihr, tying knots. Wallahi, I believed it. And then I made my mind up, I'm not going to drink anything. Then as I was walking up the stairs, I started doing literally all the stairs until I came into the zawia, and then I saw people reading the Quran, other people silent doing dhikr, and then when the Shaykh came in, I said, oh, that's the Shaykh I saw praying in the first line. And his clothes were above his ankles, he had a beard. I said, there's something wrong with this man. This can't be a Sufi. Sufis should be shaven, I don't know. So anyway, I went and then I sat in the Zawiyah and they read Hizb al-Bahr. Hizb al-Bahr is one of the litanies of Imam Abu Hassan al-Shadi rahmatullahi alayhi. And we will speak about these matters as we go on, like what about these turuq, and how authentic are they, and are we even allowed to follow that if we wanted to? So we will speak about that as well when we tackle the topic of tasawwuf. So now they read Hizb al-Bahr, and it was an answer to my question. And then I asked Shaykh, can I please meet you? SubhanAllah, when I looked into the face of the Shaykh, it was like Yawm al-Qiyamah was hanging above his head. We sometimes pretend that we don't have time, but the essence of I don't have time was his aura. It was like there is no time. Like even when he speaks, he's looking, and you see a gaze that goes beyond, literally, beyond the world. That was the first time I saw this in my life. And then I said, can I meet you? He said, yes. And then when I went to the house of the Shaykh, and so I went to the house of the Shaykh, and it was like the most beautiful feeling I've ever had. It was a house of dhikr, a house of fikr, a house of hamd. Then I complained to the Shaykh about some of the Salafis that were talking ill of me. Then I mentioned the name of one of these Salafis, and he went like this, in front of my face. And he said, Nahnu, we, people of Tasawwuf, are not allowed to talk ill or to listen to people one speaks ill of. And definitely not in this house. And then when he said this, I really felt that stones would be poured down upon me as a adhab of just mentioning the name of somebody who had spoken ill of the Shaykh before even speaking ill of me. That was one of the mashayikh, that was the reason for me to think that the Shaykh was a kafir. So anyway, that was my introduction to tasawwuf. All of that was easy. Fiqh was difficult. Aqidah is difficult. One book, done. Tasawwuf, Shaykh, no problem. Tasawwuf, I now understand that tasawwuf is just what we call ihsan, right? And I'm talking about tasawwuf al-sunni, not the tasawwuf al-bid'i. And now we know what bid'ah is. It's not because the things you see do not come directly from Kitab and Sunnah, it can be haqq. Okay? So now I went to Dr. Salah Abul Hajj. He was my first Shaykh. And in fiqh, I sat with him. I was in pain. All the bid'ahs that he was sharing with me. He said, yeah, some say you can say Allahu Akbar or Kabir Allah. you can say this, you can say that. And he was coming with things that there was no dalil for it, right? And then remember what I told him? I said, Ya Shaykh, كاد كلامك أن يكون كفرا. I said, your words could have been kufr. And then he said, do you have a Salafi background? And I said, yes. And then it took me a very long time to adapt to fiqh. Because I was used for 10 years without the tools, right? To just navigate through Quran and Sunnah and making my own deen. Just follow Kitab and Sunnah. That was my motto. That was my slogan. Just Quran and Sunnah. And now somebody was telling me, it's not like you think, there is a heritage of 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, that we go by. So tasawwuf was very easy for me to accept. Aqeedah was very easy for me to accept. But fiqh was the most difficult thing. It took me more than a year to understand that you have to follow madhab. That was the most difficult thing. So this is a bit how my journey went from this to that. And the reason why was because of exposure. Exposing myself to material that was out there just waiting to be read. And since after that, I never read about people, I read from people. So I read the Zaydiyah, as I said, I think 21 books, I don't remember. I read their Aqeedah, I read their fiqh, And the only thing I can say is that to me they're very close to Ahl Sunnah. Their fiqh is very, very Hanafi. Their aqidah is Ash'ari Mu'tazili. Naam, they have a mixture of it, but they are very neutral when it comes down to accepting hadith. So they don't refuse Bukhari and Muslim, but they don't accept certain hadith based on their knowledge and science and so forth. But they have a big love for the Prophet ﷺ. They don't do takfir of Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman radiallahu anhu. They say that Uthman should have been first, that Ali should have been first radiallahu anhu. But then they talk about تقديم الفاضل على المفضول and so forth. Are we allowed to give priority to a good person over a better one? So they discuss, it's a real knowledge. And that's why their fiqh is even included in many Islamic fiqh encyclopedias, where they compare the four madahib to the Zaydi as well, and sometimes even to the Ja'fariyah. So what I've learned is, if you want to understand people and understand where they are coming from, then you have to read from them, not about them. If you don't read from them, or somebody who was from them, who can explain it, then you have no right to make a judgment. That's what I truly believe. And I believe that the Salafis, I believe their intention is good. I believe that they love the Prophet ﷺ. I believe that they genuinely look for the truth within the boundaries that they think to be the truth. But I also believe that make a lot of mistakes by limiting themselves when it comes down to being exposed to other things. Okay? So this is how these things worked. And my journey is still ongoing. Now my journey is still ongoing. I've written some books about this journey and how it worked. Then I started looking into the books of Ibn al-Qayyim and comparing them to other books, because they say he's the doctor of the hearts. And then I found that many of the things he says come from, for example, Hada'iq al-Haqa'iq of Imam Shams al-Razi, for example. Now I'm literally word per word, the same order, same structure. He doesn't refer to them, but back in the days that was not considered to be wrong, but nevertheless, if you know that somebody takes from a Sufi, then you should tell it. So that's where my journey started. So I was a Hanafi for a long time, because I studied Hanafi fiqh. I studied quite some books in Hanafi fiqh with different mashaykh. I think with 5 different mashaykh. Many of the books from beginning to the end. But then once again, I studied the Hanbali fiqh and the Shafi'i fiqh, but my Shafi'i fiqh is not strong. I had to study it to become a khatib for the government of Jordan. So I had to study mu'amalat and ibadat in the Shafi'i fiqh. We were tested thoroughly in it. So, but that's I think my weakest, or maybe the Maliki, I don't know. But then the Hanbali fiqh, I continued with studying it. And then eventually that's the one I practice now, because some people ask me, which madhab do you follow? Only when I teach the Hanafi madhab, I stop being a Hanbali. Because I do not want to teach what I don't practice, because then I will get confused. Do you understand what I mean? But the Hanafi fiqh, strangely enough, is the fiqh I love the most. It's so beautiful, and you can only know if you study it. So I advise you to become a Hanafi, so that we can benefit from your aql salim wal fahm al mateen. Allahumma rabbi ameen. So I felt like I wanted to share this with you. So I'm sorry if it was a bit personal. But it has to do a little bit with bid'ah and everything that is connected to it. And so as I said, because I've read from all of them, studied with many of them, I believe that even the Mu'tazila were looking for the truth. They didn't try to demolish the deen. They tried to defend it and protect it, but they went wrong in some of the things. When it comes down to Aqidah, but they protected the Quran as well. Yeah, which is a paradox, because they say that up to 11 that the Quran is makhluk, but what they mean by that is also to be seen. And on the other hand, they also worked to protect and defend the Quran as well. So it's important, barakallahu fikum, that at least you are aware that all of these people are looking for the haqq. And Shaykh bin Baz rahmatullahi alayhi was one of the most pious people I've seen. SubhanAllah, he was the reason that my father embraced Islam. He made dua 3 times, and he said, Allahumma ja'al hadha al-walada hidayatan li abihi. And I saw him after asking Allah, arini, let me see one of the most beloved people to you on the face of the earth, when I was in Mecca. And people invited me 3 times, and I asked it 3 times. And it was eventually turned out to be Shaykh bin Baz rahmatullahi alayhi. So he was a man with a lot of taqwa, with a beautiful soul. I prayed next to him. He was shivering, subhanAllah, when he was shivering. There were ayat about qiyamah, and I was standing next to him, and he, subhanAllah, you felt his fear being absorbed by your body. I've never seen this. It was ajib. I've never seen even a Sufi doing as much dhikr as he did. Like to sit with him at the same sufra, yani at the table, yani which was just on the floor, right? Just to sit with him and being alone with him when yani and two of his readers was one of the biggest blessings. It was the reason for my father to be guided. So I believe that there are ashaira with behavior of shaitan. There are salafis with behavior of the malaika. So belonging to something doesn't turn you into a good being. It is what you do with what you know. So it's not like, oh, I'm an ashari, now I'm the best person on face of the earth. No, you're not. At all. So this is why I love everybody. Which doesn't mean that you can't refute them, but refute them for the sake of the science. But know that they can be 1,000 times better than you. So if you go like that through your life, you will never wrong anybody. So Shaykh bin Baz rahmatullahi alayhi, may Allah have mercy on his soul and elevate his rank and give us a part of his hal. Rahmatullahi alayhi, and like that I have so many salafis. Shaykh Abu Islam, subhanAllah, qiyam, siyam, he would read the Quran so much, so often. His forehead was like really dark because of the many sujoods, and he did so much siyam. He gave khutbah until his last breath. Shaykh Musa Nasr, when he's also a Salafi, right? Whom I studied Quran with, he would literally walk hand in hand with me to look for a car. And we would, because my car was damaged, and he would walk with me. That was a Shaykh, a Qari, in the lineage of Shaykh al-Husari. He said, come, you are Muhajir, wa nahnu al-Ansar. So he would walk with me hand in hand. He died 2017 on his way to Mecca, to Medina. Rahimahullah wa rahmatun wasi'ah. So I'm very grateful for every Salafi teacher that I had, and it sounds very strange, but I need to share their virtues and their value. No, Shaykh al-Uthaymeen, I will do a separate class about what he has done for the Ummah. Rahmatullahi alayhi.